Picture this. It's 1991 and India is teetering on the edge of total economic collapse. I mean, the country was basically about to go bankrupt. But then, in the face of this massive crisis, a quiet revolution began, sparked by just three little letters: L, P, and G. Let's dive into this incredible story of how India pulled itself back from the brink. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to rewind and see just how bad things really were. Then we'll break down this three-part solution, see what it actually looked like on the ground, and we'll wrap up by looking at the legacy of these reforms 30 years on.
Okay, so to really get why this revolution was so huge, you have to understand just how desperate the situation was. The Indian economy at the dawn of the 1990s was, well, it was in critical condition.
And this isn't some abstract academic question. This was the real-life cliffhanger India was facing in 1991. The country was literally running out of cash. We're talking about not being able to pay for the most basic essential imports, like oil.
Just how bad was it? Well, India's foreign exchange reserves, the cash it has for international trade, had shrunk to just $6 billion. Now, that might sound like a lot, but it was barely enough to cover 3 weeks of imports. 3 weeks! The country was just staring down into a financial abyss.
So how on earth did it get this bad? Well, a crisis like this doesn't just pop up overnight. This was years in the making. For a long time, the government was spending way more than it was earning. And to cover the gap, what did it do? It borrowed heavily. Add in skyrocketing prices for everyday goods, that's high inflation, and just some plain inefficient management, and you've got a recipe for a perfect economic storm. So, with its back against the wall, India had no choice but to go to the big lenders, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They said yes to a loan, but, and this is a huge but, it came with a massive string attached. India had to completely tear down its old, closed-off economic system and launch what became known as the New Economic Policy. This was the moment everything changed.
And that new economic policy, it was built on 3 really powerful ideas, famously known today by the acronym LPG. First up, the L. That stands for liberalization. And this was all about, setting the Indian economy free. It meant tearing down the notorious license raj, this insane web of government permits you needed for practically everything, from starting a business to expanding one. It had been choking innovation for decades.
Next, we've got P for privatization. Pretty straightforward. This was about the government selling off its ownership in state-run companies. The whole idea was to bring in private money and, maybe more importantly, private sector efficiency to businesses that were often, let's be honest, slow and not very profitable. And last but not least, G for globalization. This was a huge one. It was all about opening India's doors to the rest of the world, welcoming foreign companies, foreign money, new technology, and at the same time, connecting Indian businesses to markets all across the globe.
All right, let's really dig into liberalization, because this was arguably the most sweeping and immediate change of the 3.
I mean, just look at this table. It really shows you the night and day difference. Can you imagine an economy where you needed a license for almost any industry? That was the reality before 1991. After, poof, most of that red tape was just gone. The central bank's role totally flipped from being a strict watchdog to a facilitator, and foreign investment, which was once kept at arm's length, was now being welcomed with open arms. We're not talking about small tweaks here. This was a complete change in how the economy was designed to work.
And yeah, this wasn't just one single change. It was a total overhaul that touched pretty much every single part of the economy. Industry, banking, taxes, foreign currency, trade, all of it was fundamentally rewired to be more open and more driven by the market.
Okay, so that was liberalization. Now let's look at the other 2 legs of the stool that held this transformation up: privatization and globalization. So how did privatization actually work? Well, the main tool was something called disinvestment. That's basically a fancy word for the government selling off its shares in what are called public sector undertakings, or PSUs. And the goal wasn't just to make a quick buck. It was about bringing in that private sector discipline, modernizing these often outdated companies, and giving the really good ones, the Navratnas, the freedom to compete on the world stage. Globalization, on the other hand, was like flipping a giant open for business sign for the whole world to see. These reforms suddenly made India a really attractive place for big international companies to come in, invest their money, build factories, and sell their products.
And hey, you want a perfect example of this in action? Look no further than Ford Motors. Just 4 years after the reforms kicked off, this American giant came in and dropped a huge amount of money on a plant near Chennai. And get this, by 2017, they weren't just selling tens of thousands of cars in India, they had turned India into an export powerhouse, shipping almost 200,000 cars to places like South Africa, Mexico, and Brazil.
All right, so the reforms happened. The changes were massive. But the real question is, what's the verdict now, after more than 3 decades? Let's take a look at the long-term impact. I mean, just look at these numbers. They're absolutely staggering. This chart shows foreign investment going from a mere $100 million right before the reforms to $30 billion by 2018. That's not double or triple, that's a 300 times increase. It's just a massive vote of confidence from the rest of the world in India's economy. And hey, remember those foreign exchange reserves that were almost gone? Well, from that scary low of just $6 billion in 1991, India's reserves shot up to over $400 billion. That gave the country a financial safety net, a kind of stability it had really never had before. So the big picture numbers look amazing, right? No doubt about it. But, and there's always a but, the reforms also got a lot of criticism. The benefits weren't exactly shared equally by everyone in the country. Yeah, these reforms were no silver bullet. Critics point out some really important problems. For one, while the economy grew, it didn't always create enough new jobs. You might have heard the term jobless growth. Then there's the agriculture sector, where a huge chunk of the population works, which was kind of left behind and grew much slower. Even industrial growth started to lose steam after the initial excitement. And the whole process of selling off government companies, let's just say it was often very controversial. On top of all that, as India jumped into the global economy, it joined groups like the World Trade Organization. And this has kicked off a really important ongoing debate about whether the rules of global trade are actually fair. Do they really help developing nations, or do they just give the countries that are already rich an even bigger advantage? Look, the 1991 reforms were born out of a crisis, and there's no denying they created the modern Indian economy we see today. They pulled the country back from the brink and kick-started decades of growth. But they also left us with a new set of challenges, which, leaves us with a pretty big question. What will the next great transformation for India look like?